waters separated on day 2, and we have oceans very late in the evolutionary scale, after the creation of the earth. We have the earth also late in the evolutionary scheme, and on day 3, actually the earth is already present even before day 1, but God is dealing with the earth in day 3, at least the dry land. So the earth is before the stars and the galaxies, out of sequence. Vegetation, day 3, again, it's out of sequence. The first cell, according to the evolutionists, from the ocean, much later than the stars, galaxies, and plants, at least in the creationist, well, I shouldn't say much later, just a matter of hours later. Fruit trees, another inconsistency, created on day 3. That comes way late, after animals even. So vegetation is on the earth, not in the oceans. Fruit trees before animal life. Lots of inconsistencies. Vegetation before the sun. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole sequence. I'm just going up to day 4, where we have one of the most important inconsistencies in the two schemes. So vegetation before the sun, moon also on the fourth day. So again, out of sequence. Heavenly bodies, again, on 4th day. Now, planets aren't mentioned. They're probably implied in the stars. I'll explain that when we get to the text. So the point I'm making here is we have all of these inconsistencies. So how do we answer that? And I think this passage in Genesis 1, beginning in verse 14, gives us some answers and gives us the basis for coming up with an alternative to the evolutionary explanation. So this is just nothing more than the outline that I've got on your outline sheet there, so you can follow this. I see verses 14 through 16 dealing with the creative process, or God creating. And then in verses 17 through 19, God placing these heavenly bodies. That seems to be the emphasis of the second part. They're kind of complementary, and they deal with similar issues, and I'll go through the latter part a little bit more quickly. So let's look at these verses. Beginning in verse 14, then God said, we said again, as we've seen in every one of the creative days, God speaking, God revealing what He's about to do. He speaks. So He speaks things into existence. He's the creator. He's the one that speaks things into being. So we call that revelation, God speaking. We saw it in verse 3. We saw it in verse 9, or 6 and 9. Verse 11, we'll see it again in verse 20. We'll see it again in verse 24 and on other occasions. In fact, it occurs 10 times. One commentator called this the 10 Commandments of God's creation, where He commands certain elements of the creation into being. So He speaks, and then things happen. Very different. What this implies is this is instantaneous. This does not require any time. This does not require any processes. God speaks and it happens. We call that creation by fiat. What we mean by that is God commands and things come about. He decrees and things exist. And then it is articulated further. Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens. The expanse is this stretched out space, if you will. King James translates it the firmament. It refers, I think, to this space that we saw in day 2. So let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, the stretched out area of the heavens. Now, in this case, the heavens are that beyond the earth, even beyond the atmosphere in this context, to separate, and immediately we have, in the next part, we have a purpose giving for these lights that God creates or speaks into being. And we have at least three things that are purposed. And the first one is to separate. It says to separate the day from the night and to let them be for signs. There's the part of that separation for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. So it clearly spells out. And notice it doesn't say for worship. It doesn't say anything related to anything spiritual. It has to do with regulating. It has to do with administering, you might even say, events primarily on planet Earth. Now, when it says for signs, let them be for signs, it does not mean several things, at least in this context. First of all, it does not give support to astrology. There's no support for astrology here. The astrologist would use this passage in support of that. That's totally foreign to not only biblical thinking, but a biblical worldview. And there are specific Old Testament passages, Deuteronomy 4, for example, other passages where astrology is actually condemned, where astrology is not encouraged from a biblical worldview. So the signs are not astrological signs. Secondly, they're not necessarily in this context to reveal God. Now we're going to see overall and in general, they do reveal something of God because Psalm 19 tells us that. But in this context, I think the passage qualifies for us what it means and the particular area that Moses had in mind. And remember, context determines meaning. And in this case, the context seems to direct us to the idea that the signs that are in view here, even though in other passages, I think other passages like Psalm 19, Romans 1, tell us that the creation and the heavens actually do tell us something about God. But in this context, the signs here primarily relate to something else. Seasons, days, etc. Does that make sense? Now, some say that the stars are used, or at least the stars, for navigation, and that's true. And we see that even in biblical times as well. In other words, they've been used for that purpose. And in a secondary sense, you might say, maybe God created them for that as well. But in this context, the primary emphasis is in terms of time, the relationship to time. So the passage, I think, gives specificity to the idea that we have here. Now, we see from some passages in the Old Testament, I won't give you those, but God uses the heavenly bodies in conjunction with prophetic statements. And particularly in the book of Revelation, we see some of them as signs of God's judgment and evidence that God is judging the earth, for example. And you see references to them in Joel chapter 2 and other passages like that in the Old Testament, where God uses them in a prophetic sense to basically say, I am doing a work here, a judging work. So prophecy, kind of a subset of that, is particularly in judgment. God judging. Now again, in this context, there's no allusion to judgment because we don't even have sin. But in other contexts, that element is brought out. The main reason or the main meaning of the word signs here are for times and seasons. And we've already said the day is scheduled according to the rotation of the sun or the earth around the sun. It defines our days. And the passage says itself to separate the day from the night. And it separates day from night. It makes distinctions. And let them be for signs for the seasons. The whole Jewish calendar was set primarily based on the movement of the moon and the position of the moon and the phases of the moon. So the moon set forth the calendar for the Jewish calendar of feasts and celebrations. And that's one of the purposes of the original design of heavenly bodies, particularly the moon. Now, Jim pointed out that the week is not set by any astrological or any heavenly or celestial body, but the whole creation week, Exodus 20, is the basis for the 7-day week. And it's interesting that that's the basis of everybody's week, even pagan cultures all through time. It comes basically from creation. But no particular or no specific heavenly body. The pattern is the whole creative week. So that's what the signs mean, I think, in verse 14. So we have some more purposes given to us in verse 15. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens, to give light on the earth. So they're given for illumination. They're given for at least 3 purposes: for separation or distinctions, divisions, day and night, for signs or for regulating the calendar, and thirdly, in order to illuminate. And not only illuminate, but to provide energy and all that is required for the sustenance of life. Everything that you and I are dependent upon ultimately finds its source and dependence in the sun. And God created that on day 4. So he gives us 3 purposes here. Now, when we get to 17 through 19, we see these same 3 purposes. I'm not going to go over them again. They're given, however, in reverse order. And it seems to emphasize the point that God has plans, He has design, He has purposes, even for things that we take for granted every day, the heavenly bodies that we think little of because we just take them for granted. It's so every day, if you will. And then the passage characteristically ends, like all of the others that we've seen, and it was so. And you have the immediacy of fulfillment. In other words, God spoke, and not after millions and millions of years or billions of years of time, not after naturalistic processes, but, and it was so. In other words, immediate fulfillment. God speaks, and it happens. No process, no time. And that's the theme throughout this whole passage of all 6 of the days. God speaks, it happens immediately, the immediacy of fulfillment. And that's an emphasis. We've already seen it in the first 3 days, and now we see it on the 4th day again. God is seeming to say, did you not get it the first 3 times? Well, on the 4th day, same thing. If you don't get it after the 4th day, look at the 5th day, same thing. If you don't get it after that, you'll see it in the 6th day. If you don't get it after that, there's probably not much hope for you to get it. Okay? So immediate accomplishment. Then in verse 16, we have the manufacturing. God made the 2 great lights. We have the Hebrew word asah. We don't have bara. We've had bara, which God is the only subject of that verb in the Hebrew text in the Bible. We have a manufacturing term here, asah. And probably in this context and probably in the other uses in Genesis 1, it's probably used as a synonym for bara, God creating. Now, it might include God using His own processes, but nothing natural here. So God made the 2 great lights. Now notice they're not identified, even though there is a Hebrew word, shemesh, for the sun, the first great light. They're just called lights, kind of focusing in on their function, not focusing in on necessarily their importance. I think that is even downplayed a little bit in the biblical text. So in 16 we have the making of the 2 great lights, and we know what they are. One of them would be the sun, which is the origin of the light of the moon as well. The moon reflects, obviously, the light. So God made the 2 lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night.